We are preparing to live stream the webinar.
And I think we are now live, actually. Yes.
We are now live.
Perfect. Okay, so this is my cue to start, and I'm not going to be here for very long, so just a very quick sort of cameo appearance. So good morning, everyone, on a very, as I was saying, sunny day. You can see the sun streaming out of my window here in Glasgow, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world as you're joining us. It's lovely to see your comments on the chat. I'm Dr. Dimitra Femi. I am a senior lecturer in fantasy and children's literature, and I'm co-director of the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic here at the University of Glasgow. I will very shortly hand over to my co-director, Dr. Rob Muslin, who will be chairing this entire series of talks and workshops on fantasy and puppetry. But I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you all on behalf of the Centre. The Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic was founded in September 2020, but was built on over 5 years of earlier fantasy-related activities, teaching, research, and public engagement here in Glasgow. Some of our flagship activities include the Fantasy Masters, the Fantasy Lit program that Rob founded, the only fantasy-focused postgraduate program in the world, now in its 7th year. Our annual fantasy conference, GiftCon, which will be held next month for the 5th time. This month, actually, it's April, yes. Our fantasy book series, which publishes monographs and edited collections with Bloomsbury Academic titled Perspectives on Fantasy, and our very successful public-facing events, both on campus and online, involving authors, designers, artists, and academics working in all aspects on fantasy. And you can find previous recordings of our past events on our YouTube channel. We will put links on the chat in a minute. So the Centre aims are to conduct and disseminate world-leading research in fantasy and the fantastic, to educate and support a diverse cohort of scholars working on fantasy at master's, PhD, DFA, and postdoctoral level, and most crucially for today's event, to bring together academia and the wider fantasy community, including creators and performers, in order to understand fantasy's transformative intellectual, cultural, and social potential. So this last part of the remit is very much what today's event is addressing. We will hear from amazing award-winning creative practitioners about the art of puppets and puppeteers in bringing fantasy and the fantastic to life on stage, on screen, and on the page. And I really can't wait to learn from our extra special guests today. But enough of me, let me pass on the baton to my co-director, Dr. Rob Muslin, who will introduce everyone properly and will share today's series of sessions. Before I do so, may I also thank the Chancellor's Fund at the University of Glasgow who funded this event, our event administrator and creative practitioner herself, Marita Arvaniti, who apart from being one of our speakers today, worked so hard behind the scenes on organizing and setting up and sorting things out. And of course, Rob Muslin, who dreamt up this entire event and made it all happen. Thank you all for being here. Rob, over to you.
Welcome, world, to Fantasy and Puppetry, a celebration of the art of puppets and puppeteers in bringing fantasy and the fantastic to life on page, stage, and screen. The event was planned really by my colleague, Dr. Dimitra Femi, who's just been talking, in conjunction with Terri Windling, and is sponsored by the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic, of which Dimitra and I are co-directors. My name, as Dimitra just said, is Rob Muslin, and I'll be your host for this event. Today, you'll be given behind-the-scenes access to 5 of the most exciting and celebrated puppet-centered artists, writers, puppeteers, and performers working in the world today. Brian and Wendy Froud, Howard Gayton, Mary Robinette Kowal, and William Todd-Jones, all brought together by their friendship with World Fantasy Award-winning writer, editor, and artist, Terri Windling. Between them, these artists have been closely involved in some of the finest fantasy movies, TV series, and stage performances of the last 40 years. The Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, The Muppet Movies, Lazy Town, Sesame Street, The Empire Strikes Back, Dark Crystal, The Age of Resistance, His Dark Materials, John Carter of Mars, Ice Age on Ice, The Never-Ending Story, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. The list is seemingly endless. So the program for the day is as follows. In a few minutes, there'll be an interview of Wendy and Brian Froud by Terri, followed by a question and answer session. After that, we take a break for lunch from 12:30 to 1:30. Then at 1:30, we'll have another interview by Terri, this time of her friend and neighbor, William Todd-Jones, master puppeteer for the BBC TV series, His Dark Materials, who will talk to us about bringing fantasy creatures to life in film and TV, with another question and answer session afterwards. At 3 p.m, we'll have a talk from the actor, director, puppeteer, and activist, Howard Gayton, who will tell us about bringing fantasy creatures to life in the theatre. There'll be a break for tea between 4 and 4:30. And then at 4:30, we'll have a roundtable discussion focusing on puppets and puppetry in fantasy narratives, with many digressions into the world of performance. For this, we'll be joined by the Hugo and Nebula award-winning author Mary Robinette Kowal, who also happens to be a puppeteer, and Marita Arvaniti, an experienced theatre practitioner who's writing a PhD on theatre and fantasy at the University of Glasgow, as well as myself and Terri. So we begin with our interview of Wendy and Brian Froud by Terri Windling. Before I introduce them, a small technical request. Could you please type your questions for them into the Q&A function, which you can see on your screens? If you can't find the Q&A, you can type questions into the chat, but it would be much easier if you can manage to find the Q&A function. That way, we hope to get through as many of the questions as we can in the time available. Wendy Froud is famous for her puppet making, sculpting, art, and writing of books. Most notably, perhaps, for her part in the creation of the original Yoda for the greatest of all the Star Wars movies, The Empire Strikes Back. Brian Froud is celebrated as the conceptual artist behind the movies Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal, as well as a series of astonishing books, some of them co-authored with Wendy, and a great deal more. There's no one better to introduce them to us than their friend and neighbor, Terri Windling, author of The Woodwife and groundbreaking editor, whose work helped to change the face of fantasy fiction from the 1980s onwards. Please give them a very warm welcome to your screens.
Thank you, Rob. That's a really lovely introduction. Can you hear us okay? Is our tech working? What's that?
Yes.
We need ours. Don't we need ours up? Isn't it? It should be up. It should come. Okay, on our screen, we're not seeing ourselves.
Yep, we can see you really clearly. Thank you, Terri. You're looking great.
We can't see ourselves, but that's all right.
That's fine.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction, Rob. I'm here, as you may have gathered from Rob's introduction, several of us involved in this event all live in the same small village on the edge of Dartmoor, and which is a real center of puppetry and fantasy and myth. And I'm here at Brian and Wendy's farmhouse on the outskirts of the village for this session. You may hear funny little noises going on because we are in their kitchen. There are dogs and cats wandering around and we can't control them. So we'll do our best to carry on regardless of what happens.
We will.
But Rob has introduced them so well that I don't think I need to say any more about who these wonderful people are. Let's get right into our discussion about fantasy and puppetry. And the very first thing I want to ask each of you is, when did you first, what's your first memory of being intrigued by puppets?
Oh, well, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I suspect, because at one stage in my early life, I lived by the seaside in Margate, so it has to be a Punch and Judy. Just absolutely intriguing. But the thing I think that really inspired me was going into the school library and coming across a book about ventriloquism. And that's hard to say this time of the morning. And being absolutely intrigued with the photographs in the book, of the workings, the inside workings of the puppet, and how even though the heads were complex, the where you put your hand in was actually really simple, which was a bit of a broom handle and a bit of bent wire and some string. And that's always sort of stayed with me about how simple things can create something that has a life to it, and indeed some sense of spirit. And I've actually taken the idea of wire and string with me when we've been trying to make our more sophisticated puppets for film and television. That the simpler the better is always, because they get over elaborate in the making of these things in general. And if only we can get back to a bit of bent wire and a bit of string, life would be much better.
We use I make everything with T-pins and gaffer tape, which isn't very nice, but he's mean about me sometimes.
Well, it was only well, Wendy and I met on the first days of Dark Crystal in New York, and so Wendy was brought in because of her well, beautiful dolls and her sculpting skills, and so so it was intriguing to watch Wendy sculpt, because they had to I brought some maquettes with me. I made things there just to show how things should look, and but Wendy, when we were scaling up for full size about how this would be a hand puppet, Wendy's sculpting involved a lot of tongue depressors, bits of wood, didn't it?
I didn't know how to make armatures at that point, so things kept falling apart.
Things got rather sag.
We're getting ahead of us now.
Well, okay.
Let's hear from Wendy about her first memories of puppets, and then we'll get into the dark crystal, I promise.
I think I have always, since I was able to do anything, been interested in making figures move. I loved playing with dolls when I was very, very young. And I also liked acting out from books that my mother read. She read all of the Narnia books to me, and then we read The Hobbit and went on. And from being very, very tiny, I just started manipulating dolls, and I started making them. And the more I could make them move, the more interesting they were to me to play with. I was an only child, so I had a lot of time to play and by myself with dolls and figures that I'd made. And I think that probably was the very beginning.
What's the first puppet you encountered?
The first puppet I encountered is really odd, and I can't show you. I was going to show you what it was, but I can't, because it's just on the screen. It's not going to be easy enough to show you. But it was hand puppet. It was a hand puppet, and it was actually a puppet made out of a hand that my father made to entertain me at the table. And I really can't do it now. I tried it earlier today and it just didn't show up. But anyway, it was interesting how just a bare hand could become something animate and fascinating, frightening, or funny.
So from those beginnings, can each of you give us, let's start with you this time, so your road to the Dark Crystal, and then we'll hear Brian's road to how you started working with Jim. Jim Henson, of course, who was the great puppeteer behind these films.
I moved with quite a few of my friends from Detroit. We went to CCS, Center for Creative Studies. After we graduated, a whole group of us moved to New York. And I had a little exhibition of, by that time I was making dolls and puppets anyway. I had a degree in ceramics and fabric design and jewelry making, and I applied all of that to making dolls and puppets. And all of my dolls were armatured to move. And at that point, I was making string puppets. And Jim Henson's art director, Michael Frith, came to a little exhibition that I had in the loft that I was living in, and bought a Christmas present for Jim, which was a little string puppet that I made. And I didn't think much more about it. But then just after New Year, I got a phone call asking if I would like to come in and interview for a new project that Jim was thinking of doing. And he liked my work and was interested in it enough to see if I wanted to, or would be appropriate really, to work on that project. And that was the Dark Crystal. After the interview, they said, yes, come in and work on that.
And what did you say? I know this story.
I know. When the day before I was supposed to meet Jim, Michael Frith called me and said, well, you'll have to come in tomorrow at this certain time and then, have your interview with Jim. And I said, oh, I can't. I have to pick my mother up at the airport. And the phone went just quiet for a minute. And then he said, no, you got somebody else to pick your mother up at the airport. You really, really need to do this. And that's what I tell everybody when an opportunity comes along. Don't pick your mother up at the airport. Just get somebody else to do it and take that opportunity, because it may not come again. And if I hadn't gone to that interview, none of this would have happened for me.
So Brian, for you, you have been working in London, doing art, doing illustration, which was not your favorite thing in the world, but doing your own art, which was, and you then moved out to Dartmoor and you published some books, the Land of Froud, you worked on fairies with Alan Lee. How did you move? I know you were creating puppets of your own for your own pleasure then. How did you move from working in the book world to meeting Jim?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, well, I was making stuff already at art school. And it started off by, when I was younger, I went to the theatre, and in the theatre in the foyer was an exhibition of designs for costumes. And the costumes were collaged. And I'd never really seen collage before, and this was really exciting to me. So I got involved with doing collages, and gradually the collages got thicker and thicker, and gradually they left the page, and suddenly I was making objects. I got intrigued with characters. I did a lot of things for of Dickens characters made out of polyfiller. The polyfiller is a nightmare to work with. But what's the great news about it is you've got to do it in about 3 minutes because it goes hard. So I learned how to try and get character really quickly. And so, and at that point, I got intrigued with the idea of objects and things having a life of its own. And I started to make sort of little simple rod puppets, which it seems really fairly straightforward until I realized I really was making it out of snails and chicken bones. So they were seriously weird. But when I left college and I went into illustration, I did a lot of things. I mean, I did caricatures of famous people for Radio Times, that sort of thing. So I had a whole career of making stuff. However, as you sort of touched on, I was getting really tired of this. I really wanted to do my own work. And it involved coming to Dartmoor and being into nature and part of an ancient landscape. And then I started to paint and reflect some of that. Mm-hmm. So I was looking at the landscape. I was looking at hills and trees and trying to imagine what the inside of these things were, and that's when trolls and fairies sort of started to appear. But I had made a strange puppet which I was called Granny, who was quite a large scale thing that I would take to the pub with me. Yeah, I know, she never bought a drink. It was she was rubbish. And so but my art sort of blossomed about being connected to an ancient landscape. To this land. This very place.
This place we all still have today.
And so they were on certain books. I mean, books about illustration. And the one in particular we think that Jim saw, which was the first painting I did when I came here. And it was of a troll with a waterfall falling off its nose.
Was that the Land of Froud?
No, it was Once Upon a Time.
Once Upon a Time, really early on. And Jim saw that. And so, and Jim had this idea in the back of his mind of wanting to do a really, deep puppet film, and with puppets that have never been seen before in terms of their sophistication. He had a vision that you could actually make a whole movie like this. And so he saw something in that drawing that thought I could sort of help fulfill that vision. So he didn't know I made things at that point, so
He thought you just painted.
yeah. So it was a bonus that when I did sort of show up, he invited me to come to New York to start this thing, which was really amazing to walk into the Muppet workshop.
How old would you have been then ish?
30-ish.
Yeah.
Yeah, about 30. It was the right time because I'd left some of my childhood behind, but it was just, but it was a world that I just felt at home with. And also it gave me the ability, I mean, it was really scary. I mean, because it was full of people who actually really did make things and really knew how to do it. But I sort of got that Jim really wanted to push it somewhere else anyway. That I could make some things, make some heads and things like that, just to show people what sort of detail we thought we were going to want, and then just had to forget that as we started to build. It was we started with the basics again about how you physically made this stuff, and something that we only thought was going to take us a few months took us 5 years in the end.
Yeah, to the completion of Dark
to complete. But I just learned I just sort of soaked it all in, and it's something Jim would say, and I'd never seen. Somehow I imagined it inside, and I started to design things based on puppet techniques. But I've always thought, I didn't know what I was doing, but I thought in all the 5 years, he never fired me. I must have been doing something right.
Now, what I've heard both of you say, and Wendy and I recently talked about this, is that the initial group that created the impetus for the Dark Crystal and seeded all the ideas was quite small.
It was very small. It was, there were probably 6 puppet builders. I was one of them. And
then the shy
Brian,
from
the very shy man from Dartmoor. And then Jim and Frank Oz and Michael Frith, who was the art director for it as well.
And to be clear, you two had never met before.
Oh, we've never met. No. And Brian was so shy that he really didn't talk to people at the beginning, but that soon changed. But yes, it was a very small group, and we were all, Jim was very inclusive. He was always extremely inclusive about sharing ideas and sharing methods of doing things. So we all had, we were all able to contribute to the story as well as to what the characters ended up looking like and how they acted.
That seems so different than the way you usually hear films being made with 20 million people weighing in.
Absolutely.
And initial concepts getting diluted thereby. Dark Crystal has such a well worked out vision, and the fact that it was made initially by a few of you makes sense.
But it just grew. It grew from this tiny thing into something. The world, I think, as we created the world, it expanded and got bigger and bigger. And you just Brian was amazing at creating more than we thought we needed, but found that we absolutely needed. And everything that he did.
And very much powered the vision. I mean, it's such a Froudian aesthetic throughout the movie.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what I was there for, I guess, because Jim wanted it to be sort of different.
To look like you.
Yeah. I mean, I think, before me, the clue for Jim was they did for Saturday Night Live, what was it, for Vargs, was it? They were these monster creatures that weren't terribly successful. The puppets were fantastic, but nobody quite understood what it was about because they were really, really weird. But he said the secret of it was that they used taxidermy eyes.
So they're the most realistic looking puppets that the
Very different.
The
than
workshop,
puppets.
very,
Yeah.
very
I mean,
different.
they were still made out of snip foam and bits of fabric and everything, but because of the realism of the eye, Jim thought, what if we actually really made them real? And that was what I was there for. But of course, nobody knew how to do that.
You
I
kind of
mean,
invented. the
Yeah, we
whole thing.
pioneered so much. Yeah, I mean, nobody knew how to do it, and so
Nobody had used foam latex for, I mean, I may be wrong about this, but I don't think so. Nobody had used foam latex for puppet heads and thought about putting mechanics in and skulls. We really started knowing nothing. And Jim was very good about bringing experts in to help us as well.
Dick Smith.
Dick Smith, who was an amazing film makeup person, worked with foam latex for prosthetics. So he came in and showed us how to do things. It was like being at graduate school. It was like just getting a degree in something none of us knew how to do before, but we learned so much.
Another thing I find interesting in the ways you've always talked about this process is you didn't have a script that you then translated into a film. The story grew out of the art, the puppets, the synergy between all of you working on it. You have a script here somewhere. don't you? We're going to do some audio visual aids here.
Let's see what I can find.
This is as I recall, an early script for.
Oh, yes, the first thing wasn't a script. This is just a story outline from February 11th, 1978. Not that you're going to be able to see that, but it's completely buggy,
insected.
Yeah. But because obviously it's been around for an awfully long time, but that was the first thing we worked with. And it all came from a story that Jim and his daughter Cheryl had developed mostly during a snowstorm in an airport when they were stuck in an airport. So they started developing the story, and it was just called The Crystal at that point. But everything started from this little very, very short story outline.
That's how it got developed. I mean, the initial thing Jim always says was a children's book that had crocodiles living in a palace, and he just thought that would be really cool, is to have these sort of reptilian things.
The crocodiles became a sketch.
Yeah.
To be in a palatial surroundings. That was sort of the beginning. But being Jim, because Jim was a very spiritual person, so the clues are in the Dark Crystal about that aspect. And so his idea of some characters that split apart and coming back together again was his. And so Jim liked my trolls, so that was the mystics were easy because I want them to look like that. But all we had to figure out was how big they were, and because that took a long time to figure out how big and how we were going to do it. But the creatures of the Skeksis were, I just was busy designing, and so sometimes they were more at the beginning more like fish and strange deep sea fish. But with Frank Oz and Jim Henson loved monsters, and so between them, when we were having our early meetings about what this story and what the creatures, we invented the creatures first. They just encouraged me to make them basically worse and worse, and so eventually we got to the Skeksis. But because we had the mystics, and we figured out, because in those days, I mean, it still is one of the basics of puppeteering is just the hand in the head. Those shapes are dictated by the hand. So my Skeksis had to reflect anatomically the mystics, but also it's the same phenomena of the head and the hand being expressive together.
You got some examples?
I do. Gwen, you want to hold these up? These were actually for the Age of Resistance, but they're.
I can't see that. Oh, there we go.
You can see.
Yeah.
They're
And so
Brian's original sketches, and then there's a close-up underneath.
So the So in general, my sketches
For the mystics.
I mean, nowadays in my creaky dotage, I do my sketches and I go, God, these are really rough and scratchy. And then when I look back at what I did originally for the film, I go, oh no, they're rough and scratchy. Is that it was no good at the beginning doing the end to finish it. Is that because the finished thing was the film. And so what we were trying to do is figuring out how to do it. And so there's a lot of technical aspects about, because we knew that these creatures need to be expressive.
And they had to be performed.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever that way was. So a lot of after the initial sketch, it was then figuring out how we're going to do it. And that gave changes in proportion. There were things that we had to, when we knew how we were going to do it, like hide. A lot of my designs about hiding the puppeteer, you know, because it's not Punch and Judy. We're not behind the playboard and hiding the puppeteer.
And this was in the 70s or
Yeah.
80s, right? So the blue screen technology.
There
No
was-
blue screen.
No, we didn't have that.
No,
So we couldn't, it wasn't Bunraku. I mean, we couldn't use a Bunraku
we can now. But
technique because we couldn't hide the puppeteers.
yes.
So they all had to be under the costumes or under the stage, depending on how we were shooting.
So yeah, the secret of the skexes in the end, although you know we started off and Jim was thinking they were going fairly small, and we did a test using the small ones, and I said these got to be big, that we have to puppeteer them correctly. So actually, the skexes is a Punch and Judy show because it is the whole thing. It is, so you have a Punch, which is a hand puppet. Doing that, and that's the skex's head, and then the fit up, the actual booth is the costume, and so the puppeteer is somehow hidden in the booth, and it's very back to basics for that.
And for Americans out there who are unfamiliar with Punch and Judy, Howard Gayton's going to be talking about it later today, so just hang on.
Yeah, and so and then you know, it isn't just one person. We have the other people to do other hands, and so everything about the flow of the costumes is to hide hunkered down people, and that's how. And so as we are building those prototypes and changing and getting it better and make it much more expressive, then gradually the finish, the look of it starts to come into focus. And there's a lot of hard work goes into it. We use lots of wonderful craftspeople making these costumes, because in general, they can't be made out of normal stuff. They have to have a lightness to it, because you've got somebody inside, you can't, you know, bend them, kill people. And so it's only when you get very close to the end and very close to filming does the final thing come into focus. And so when you then look back at my sketch, which seemed to be really loose at the beginning, if we've done our job well, it is exactly the same as the finished object, because we've allowed everybody's creativity to be part of it.
What have you got there?
Oh, I just wanted to show, you probably all recognize this character. This was, I have to say, one of the easiest characters to design, because there really wasn't anything except a hand in a head and something to work the two little feet. But he was so successful. It's his gig. And he was so incredibly successful. And it was just a delight to see something very simple work as well or better than all the very complicated things
I
he
think
had
that
to
was
do.
Frank Oz's fault. I think he said, I think he was so fed up with the complications. He said, like, well, can't we just do it like a ball? I just see like a ball of fluff.
And then Dave Grohl's puppeteered it.
Can you tell us something about how you came up with the Gelflings?
Oh, the Gelflings were different from the beginning, because Jim wanted heroic characters. He wanted things that were sort of human, or things that we as people would identify with. And they also needed to be hand puppets, but they needed to be much smaller than the Skeksis and the Mystics. And that was a problem, because the Mystics and the Skeksis also had hands in the heads, but the Gelflings had to accommodate, in Jen's case, Jim's hand, which was very big. And Frank originally thought that he would puppeteer Kira, and his hand was possibly even bigger than Jim's. And it was impossible to make tiny puppets that didn't distort terribly and still be comfortable for these guys to work with. So they ended up just scrunching their hands in. And Kathy Mullen did a fabulous job puppeteering Kira with a much smaller hand. But they went through a lot of different phases. So if you've seen any of the history of all of this, you will have seen some of those. But these are some of the earliest ones that, you can just hold up the whole thing probably. Just hold it up like that. And we were working on what to use for skin texture. We didn't really know. We didn't have paints at that point that didn't make the skin wrinkle. These were the first ones that we did that were cast in foam latex, but the foam latex by itself didn't work with a surface on it. We tried flocking them and they just looked strange with flock on. And the ones that you just saw had stockings stretched over them, which was nice, but it didn't have enough detail in it, so we couldn't use that either.
They were puppets and bank robbers at the same time.
At the same time. They did.
Stockings over.
Brian.
I'm conscious of the fact that we have a limited amount of time, so I want to, let's jump in time and go to Dark Crystal, the Age of Resistance.
Okay.
By then, all these years have passed. Surely puppetry techniques would have evolved. It would be easier.
You would have thought, wouldn't you?
You would have thought. Well, and in fact, most of the people involved are much, much younger than we are. And we were almost the only two people left who had worked on Dark Crystal who were involved in this project as well.
Being a television series for
Yes,
Netflix.
it was for Netflix.
For Netflix, based on the Dark
Yeah.
Crystal, called The Age of Resistance.
People kept saying to us, oh, but it's going to be so much easier because everything's moved on, there's technology. It's just going to be easy, don't worry about it. And we said, but they're still puppets and you still have a hand in the head. There's not much you can do with that except what we did. And they said, no, please, don't worry. And they found that it was just like we told them it was going to be.
Well, I mean, they thought we were crazy.
They did. They thought
I mean, there were certain things that I can't
But then
remember. Well, I think one of the mouths or something about it, and because they weren't, because everybody thought they knew, because they were like all gung ho. We know how to do this now. And I think you like stepped in and probably back to the good old fashioned T-pin. You just like stuck a T-pin in, and they were absolutely amazed. It just fixed it. And they, how do you do that? Well, actually, that's how we did it before. And these things, which are physical objects, still have the same attributes as physical objects. That so there's no better way. No, it wasn't. But the nice thing was that because of CGI, you could put things on top of the faces to give more expression, which was great. So the eyes were very expressive, and you just it brought the characters to life even more. So we were lucky in that way, and that there was green screen at that point. So puppeteers could be dressed they were dressed in green, or were they dressed in black? Yeah, green.
But and you didn't see them.
You didn't have to hide.
That was the revelation,
a
was a
huge
green
change.
screen, because in Labyrinth we use blacks.
Yes, let's go on.
And for the fireys, because that's the only way we can do it, and it does look rough. I mean, when you look at it, but now with green screen we can do all those bunraku techniques and then get rid of it, and it's liberating. It just is so magical because you the more you separate out the humanness, the puppeteers from the puppet, the more distant that is, the less it is expressive. The closer you can get people to it and to manipulate it, the better it is. And so with Bunraku, it's exactly that. And so that was an excitement to have that on the Netflix series. And then, of course, when it's seamless, we could do.
But the puppeteers on the Age of Resistance did an amazing job.
Well, I felt sorry for them.
because the
Yeah.
puppets were just as heavy as
Yeah.
they always were. There's not much you can do about that. And just as complicated to use, but they did a brilliant.
Well,
Brilliant job.
we kept saying, well, how many weeks rehearsal are you going to have? And they said,
Well,
none.
not
They were
hardly
like,
any.
they came in like
Yeah.
3 or 4 days
Yeah.
ahead of time, and they were all delighted, and they were when they got the Gelfling puppets, and they were like playing with them, and I just kept growling at them because it was all wrong, because they thought they knew how to do this, but actually, especially with the Gelflings, is less is more. You have, I mean, with the Skeksis and the Mystics, you can be as broad, really broad, but you can't with the Gelfling, because they're the
You
most
can't bounce around with it.
human of all the creatures in it. So you have to really lay back from that. I mean, so at the beginning, they were awful, but they were brilliant because they all stepped up to it, because when they went, uh-oh, okay, now we get it, now, all right. And so you have to work really hard is finding the expression in little movements.
So it was only like a day of going, oh no.
Yeah.
And then it was,
And
then it was
they were
absolutely
great.
wonderful.
And also that one of the major things was the technique of having handheld camera, because there's nowhere to hide, because in original Dark Crystal there was a camera set up, we knew where it was, so you could cheat and hide things off camera or underneath and all that. But with a moving camera that swept through it, it meant everybody was like caught in the bath with their clothes on. And so it meant they had to do take after take to get that right. What's fascinating to me is how you use puppets that are basically dead things that are brought to life by the expertise of puppeteers. Is that when it gets onto film, you still really got to go another step to bring it even further to life. And so in the Netflix series, the camera was an absolute participant in that process.
Can I bring you back in time now to explain? We've got 50 minutes left. I decided to hurry you through this stuff I could talk about for hours. Can we go back to
when it gets on?
How did that come about?
Well, we had a special showing of Dark Crystal in San Francisco, wasn't it? And it was a wonderful showing, because we were all sitting in the cinema with Jim Henson and you and the audience. But when the film was over, the screen went up, and behind it on a stage was a banquet. Which we were all joined in, and we were eating this food with people all dressed up, and it was great. And so afterwards we were in the limousine coming away from it, and we were just, by the first film, having like 5 years.
And this was Brian
it.
and myself and Jim Henson. We were the ones.
We were exhausted by it, and we said, never ever again are we going to do a puppet film. So I don't know, I think we'd had a few glasses of wine, and indeed the audience seemed to be participating of some sort of cigarettes or something going on. So maybe it was the fumes, but so we were very relaxed. And Jim said, "Shall we do another one?" And we said, "Yeah, why not?" So Jim said, "Well, what should it be about?" So Jim, his daughter was studying mythology, and she thought about like Indian mythology, and he said, "Sounds great, because of sort of chariots going across the sky, and there are gods, and they're all very colourful." And he said, "Do you know anything about that?" And I said, "No, I'm the faintest idea." Okay, so we sat there for a while, and then I said, "Well, what about goblins?" And so he, "Oh, great, that sounds great, goblins, yeah," because suddenly we were in an area that I think we all understood. And he said, "Well, what about goblins?" And I said, "Well, they, like, traditionally they sort of steal things, and that's we immediately got to a goblin stealing a baby, which, because Jim's point was, he said, "I want to do another film, but this time I want to put human beings in it." So once I got the idea of a baby and goblins, I thought we're off and running now, because I knew that a baby surrounded by goblins visually is just going to be really
So this.
There we are.
intriguing. And so when I got back to England, that's the first thing I did. I painted that picture.
And you didn't have a baby?
No baby.
No.
You were married.
We were married,
Yeah.
but
So
I wasn't even pregnant at that point.
Yeah. So the other thing we invented in the limousine was the idea of a labyrinth, because a labyrinth seemed to me was not only a physical place, but it was a metaphorical sort of mindset. So liberators, and that basically was it. And so back to England, I painted that picture. I started to paint other characters, all with the in my head that they would be puppets or people in costumes puppeteering. So we invented a lot of characters first, and then we decided to develop the story from there. And so what was fascinating about the baby and was that the time we came to film, we realized that we needed a baby, which was, we always said a year old, wouldn't it? Something like that.
Yeah.
And so we thought, well, where are we going to get a baby from? And we thought, oh, wait a minute, we've got one. We got a baby.
So by then you had a baby.
And
We had a baby.
That was
so
exactly the
that was
right age.
yellows on the floor.
And that was Toby, who was called Toby in the script because he was a Toby in real life. And we thought,
And he needed to be able to respond to his name. So that's why the baby's called Toby in the film.
And so the challenges was like, Jim knew that human beings and puppets would work together because they did the Muppet Show, and that was all. You know, we knew that people did react really well to creatures, you know, in real space and real time.
I think that's a nice one of Ludo.
So that's, I mean, Ludo was sort of fairly straightforward to design because Muppets were, you know, great at making big walk around monsters. So we just knew he was going to be one of those. But the challenge was, of course, to make him really like lovable. I mean, as a character. So in Labyrinth, there are these guys, and that was, to me, that was like pure puppetry, because I thought, what's the most simple thing, which comes back to Punch and Judy, is a puppet over the top of a playboard. So all we've got is the heads over the top of these instructions, whatever that you call that, being a puppeteer. And then I thought, well, also we could puppeteer underneath. So we put the heads underneath. So it's the most simplest thing you could do. And so it's a lot of what I do is comes out of restrictions, coming out of what the strengths of a puppet is, or things that they really can do, and stay away from the things they can't do, and how do you hide the things that they can't do, and so, or just build on their strengths. And so the fact that they don't walk around, just stand there next to a door.
And then this is an even more simple one. You see that?
Oh, that was so we were getting pretty close to filming, what we thought, and Jim invited Terri Jones from Monty Python in because he thought the script needed tweaking. So Terri came in, walked around the workshop, saw what we were doing, really loved it all, but I happened to have sketchbooks on my workbench, and he started flicking through it and laughing, and he said, oh, we're going to do that. So he rewrote a lot of the script by just picking out stuff from my sketchbook, which we then had to, you know, hurry up and build.
Which meant that whole scenes, characters and whole scenes that we had wanted to put in never made it into the film because Terri replaced it with other things.
This being an example.
That being an example of one of the ones that we didn't get to do, which we were all sorry about because it's such a great character.
So you've talked about the technical ways that these characters were created and how the materials themselves affected them, how the script affected them, how the performance affected them. I want to go a little deeper because you're talking about how you're bringing them to life.
Mm-hmm.
But I know from knowing your work all these years that the art that comes through you starts with life. You're channeling magic and myth and a whole world view about reaching the other. Your art is a doorway into a magical animist view of the world. So can you talk a little bit about what you, before it goes to film, when it's sketches on the page, when it's demo that you're sculpting or a line of story that you're writing, the impulse that brings those ideas up in the first place?
Well, can I just say, the use of doorway as a word is really perfect, because it is a door into that world, but it is also a door out of that world. And we venture into that world, but we bring back with us the characters from that world into this world. And it really feels like that. It feels like they have a life in that world before we meet them, but then we meet them and bring them back and give them a life in this world as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Well, and you've talked, Brian, about meeting the other. The other world being the word other being very important.
Well, I remember that, like, the first day walking into the Muppet workshop, and actually the chap in the corner, Don Celine, who was the old puppet builder, you know, and him just like, he was making things, but he knew how to play, and he played, you know. And so the fact that he picked up a bit of fur and a bit of feather and like do this and shake it, and it came to life. And well, that's pure magic. When you just see, you know, a bit of fur over there, something here, and he puts it together and he does that, and it has life. Now that's quite extraordinary.
That's magic in the metaphysical sense as well as the
and so to me, it's always hanging on to that. And so because the other thing that's just happened there is you as the viewer have participated in this, because without you reacting to it, it doesn't have the life. And so it's been intriguing, you know, when we were building stuff for our films, nobody else was doing that. And then it sort of fell out of favor, because everybody decides that CGI is going to be the new thing, and it's going to be much better, it can do all that. But I find that CGI often can be distancing. You don't feel part of it. And so when I paint and I try to express fairies, you know, this is a crazy idea, but how do you paint something you can't see? You know what I mean? I mean, can't, you know, do it exist, but make you believe, and
you can feel.
Yeah, and hang on to the actual essence, the spirit of it, and get you to do it. I mean, I found in my career, when I've been labeled as a fantasy artist, I keep saying I'm not a fantasy artist, I'm a realist. I mean, that's if I'm doing my job well, it's real, and you feel it's real. But when other fantasy artists work, I look at it and go, it's too shiny.
Some fantasy art.
Some
I have to.
No,
I know, me too.
You're absolutely right.
Fantasy art out there.
I
The kind you don't
I agree.
like.
Yes,
It's very illustrative and flat.
Yeah. And so when my paint is it's rough, but it's about what you miss out. I mean, it's about spaces. When I started to illustrate, well, the way I did it was I looked at the sentence that you were supposed to illustrate, and I go, it was no good just doing it as the sentence is. Look for the spaces between the words, and that's what I try to do is to do that, and I do that in the art. So it's the spaces in between the physicality. It allows you as the viewer to be part of that world, and also especially now, if you do that with puppets, and they're not all tidied up, you know, there's loose bits, there's things that are not quite right. And
which is part of the problem with CGI.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. It's all perfect.
So it's all about the texture, meaningful texture, and real stuff. Allows you as a viewer to be part of it. You are co-creating this when you see it on the screen or on the stage. Yeah, because it's different each time.
Yeah.
It's always alive. And that's truly magical. Whereas CGI just sits on it, you're done. You know, there it is. Okay, that's great. Okay, but then how do you get involved? And that's why I think puppetry, especially with the now, is just becoming more important again. It seems to me, to express not only just story, but the actual what the story is. Yeah, it's quite, you know, that's why I'm getting excited about it all again. Yeah.
And I know you've got some really great things coming up that you're working on, but you can't talk
We
about
can't talk
yet.
about it yet, but hopefully in the near future there will be some ballet.
The ballet,
The ballet we can,
that's
yes,
been announced.
yes.
Yeah.
When the Wayne McGregor studio, which is part of the Royal Ballet, is going to be doing a production based on Dark Crystal, and it's going to be amazing, and hopefully, yeah. But his work is incredible, and we can't wait to see what's going to happen. We will be involved in it, but
Will there
it's
be
really-
puppetry in it?
there will be a bit of puppetry in it, yes, but there will be
Some.
mostly dance because it's a
Yeah.
dance.
Costume and dance.
Yeah.
Which I think will
But
bring us back to the very essence of when we did the original film about how we
Mhm.
figured out how to do the mystics, was that we trained, we
Movement.
had trained
It's
dancers,
movement, yeah.
but movement,
Yeah.
when they trained for like 6 months of physical arduousness to do it.
But his approach is very, very beautiful and very strange, and it's going to be great.
I can't wait for that.
Yeah. So hopefully, this time next year
Next year.
we'll be able to see it.
So I have one last question for each of you, which is there are going to be a lot of people out there who are beginning in this field themselves and want to create fiction or films or puppets or dance or in their various art forms, work that also brings magic to life, that brings enchantment back to the world. Advice?
I think if you want to work in these fields at all, it has to be a vocation. It can't be something you just decide like, oh yeah, I want to write something. Oh yeah, maybe I'll make a puppet. Because they're difficult. These are difficult fields to go into. And you really need to do it from the heart.
Do you know that great quote from Ursula Le Guin, and I'm going to mangle it because I don't have it right in front of me, but she talked about how fantasy is a journey, and like all intense journeys, it's not safe. It will change you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's one that once you start that journey, if it is a vocation, you never leave it. And I don't know if you even get to the end of it when you die. I don't think you do. I think you continue on.
Play. It's all about play.
It is about having a sense of humor.
Yeah, but definitely play with stuff. Pick up stuff and do that, you know, and just dish mop and a couple of things, make eyes and wiggle it about. But that's the beginning. But I mean, no matter how sophisticated we were making our puppets for the Netflix series, it was always fascinating, that moment where everybody's working together, and like say for the mystics, and you've got several people around doing hands, because a lot of that stuff was finished just hours or minutes before.
Minutes before
it was. I mean, to get it onto the set. But that moment where everybody's working together and it comes to life, even though you can see how it's been done, you always believe it. You always get focused on that. But and then everybody works hard to perform and do that. But when it's sort of done and they're exhausted, they always make jokes. The character has another. It's very interesting, a character being a character in the story, but then they have another story going on at the same time. But they're always alive.
Yeah.
You know, because you can't. The saddest thing, you can never like put the puppet on it. You know, it always has life. And I think once you grasp that, it's an amazing world to be part of. And also, I feel that don't get locked into how it looks, about what things look. You know, it doesn't have to have a finish on it and all that, but it's how it feels about what. And then your job is to listen to what it's saying to you. That's the otherness of it. No, this is quite extraordinary how these things develop their own voices.
Oh, but that's really true. I mean, I think you can see this character. You have to listen, and you have to be able to change things as these as the characters develop, they have their own idea about what they want to be and how they want to look. And if you don't listen,
Yeah.
they don't come out nearly as well. So you really have to create this
Dialogue. with
dialogue
the-
with,
The
yeah,
character, the material.
absolutely.
I think that's, we've just reached our 12 o'clock time.
Oh,
It's
wow.
a wonderful place to
Thank
end it. I'm sure there are going to be some really great questions. Rob?
Hello. I think what we need just now, though, is a little 5-minute break. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
Thank you.
Very good. We'll take that 5-minute break, and in 5 minutes we'll be back and we'll start to respond to your questions. Thank you for a stunning talk. We're looking forward to the next little phase.
Mute it.
Hi, Rob, we're back. We can't hear you though.
Hi, Terri, Brian, and Wendy. Are you? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, can you hear us?
Are we
Yes,
live
we
to
can hear you
everybody? or
beautifully.
just you?
And I have to say that was one of the great interviews of the world.
We could have gone on for another hour at least.
So could all of us. Well, we can go on for a little while at least, and we've got some great questions that have come in. I apologize in advance; we won't be able to get through all of them, but we'll start. I'll start with one which I think everyone's been asking, which is about the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance. Can you give us any indication of why it was cancelled, and also other possibilities that it might be revived in some form?
I'll say, first of all, there are possibilities that it might be revived in another form. Yeah, we're not, none of us at Henson's are giving up on that at all. I think there was a regime change at Netflix, for one thing. The viewing numbers weren't strong enough to justify the amount of money spent on it to begin with. And then COVID. I mean, all three of those things together meant that it just was one of those kind of impossible situations.
Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate for us because in developing it, obviously there needed to be some other more series. It wasn't meant to be one series, and so it meant that it became a bit lopsided.
We needed more mystics.
We needed more mystics, and we were going to get that in the second series, and so it just seemed unfortunate that they cancelled it.
But I think we're determined to find a way to continue the story.
Yeah, that's what we want.
That's terrific news.
It was unfortunate. It won. It won what best
best children's
show. So
then,
yeah, it's unfortunate.
Cancelled it the same day.
On the same day we got that award, and then they cancelled it.
No.
The ways of studios. Well, we another question from DM Anderson. Are there any books or resources you'd recommend to someone looking to get into the art of puppet making?
I don't know, because I really don't know now. I mean, I know when I started, I found a book in the library, but then also I found the good old days when bookshops had a variety of interesting books. I did find one on making puppets, which just was very inspirational to see the whole variety of it, and so I really don't know what's out now.
All of the making of books of things are usually very interesting and have a lot of information in them, like there's one for Labyrinth, there's one for Dark Crystal, there's one for the Age of Resistance. They're all good at showing the behind the scenes things, so you can see what some of the techniques were.
So those making of books would be a really good starting point. We've got some people who are obviously in the process of using and making puppets. CK asks, they've got a question for Wendy. What's your creative process for creating a new character or puppet? And then there's another bit of the question, which I really like. Do you have any tips on keeping puppets from getting smelly?
Oh, I'll answer that first. I'm not really the one, because I don't puppeteer, and I'm also not the person who takes care of the puppets after. I'm not a wrangler, so they're the ones that know about. It's probably Febreze, something like that. You just have to spray something inside. Sweaty hands, they're always going to be smelly.
I love the term wrangler.
Wrangler, yeah, they're the people that look after they're fabulous people, and they look after everything on set and off of set and take care of the puppets.
Yeah, wranglers are really important. We had a couple of really great ones on the Netflix series, because not only have they got to get the puppet ready for the scene, they have to know what's going to happen in the scene, because often there are different rigs on puppets, and they have to do different things, so they're rigged in a different way. But also, if things sort of break, they've got to know how to fix them immediately, because it's very expensive when you're filming. You haven't got time to be waiting around, and servicing puppets. So their wrangling is a really important job, and probably They have the tips for hygiene, puppet
Yeah, they
hygiene.
do.
This is
CK
a subject I never really thought about, puppet hygiene.
CK, seek out a wrangler. I love that idea. Also, I now realize you shouldn't work with children, animals, or puppets in cinema. Wonderful.
Oh, did you want
Okay,
me to talk about the creative process or not? I can.
Yes, if you would do that.
For a new character, if it's for something that I'm working on with Brian, he will give me a sketch to begin with. And then what I'll usually do is make a maquette, which is a small version, a sculpted version of whatever the puppet's going to be. It can be a head or it can be a full figure, depending on how much detail we want to go into. When that gets approved by someone, then you go into sculpting the main puppet. If you want to,
Yoda, for example.
Yoda was different because he was already he'd gone through a few different sculpts from Stuart Freeborn and different people, but they brought me in to sculpt in foam rubber the way Miss Piggy was sculpted and Bunsen Honeydew, to snip foam with scissors and razor blades and cut out a face. So I did that to begin with, and I made a puppet that Frank could use to start the characterization. And that was really interesting. And you can do that. We did that on Labyrinth a lot. I also did a lot of those kind of puppets for many of the characters. So people could start to see and start to develop a character before you lock it down in something that's going to be cast. And that's a really good way, because you begin to develop the way the character looks and the way the character reacts and becomes alive.
So what materials would you mainly use for a macaque, for instance, one of that early stage?
I would use just clay or polymer clays, anything that you can paint afterwards and put hair on. You want to make it look as real as possible, and then work from that to begin with.
Another question. Ricardo has a good question, I think. After Age of Resistance, what do you feel could be an ideal project to bring together puppetry and new technologies in modern mainstream entertainment?
Well, that's probably one we can't talk about.
Yeah.
Good.
We're still attempting to do that.
Yeah. We are.
So you have an ideal project in mind, but you're not allowed to talk about it.
No, we're not, but we do.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel it fascinates me is that I think because the response of, say, puppetry on stage, you know, like the War Horse, for instance, how people really responded to a large scale puppet where you see how it's done and you believe the emotions of it. That it's an area that I do feel that needs to be explored more, because it's, you know, because part of our conversation when we just had our bathroom break, we didn't go, we were too busy talking. We really got fired up about this, talking about puppetry, but it is about the difference between puppetry and CGI. And so I think, you know, our discussion is about the marriage between the two, you know, the partnership, I think is actually a really exciting
is brilliant and will become even better. It is very exciting. The new technology is wonderful and it keeps getting better. And I think the marriage of the two, puppetry and that kind of technology, is going to be fascinating.
Yeah, I think Todd's going to be talking a little bit about that this afternoon, about the marriage of puppetry and CGI. Yeah. It's a really interesting subject there.
Definitely.
I wonder, I can ask Michelle's question now. For both Wendy and Brian, how does sketching help generate ideas for developing characters?
That's for Brian. I don't sketch.
Okay.
Now, we were touching on that a little early on. I can't remember where it was, but it is about. I'm going to start somewhere weird. Years ago, I was guest of honor at the World Fantasy Convention in America, and I went, and I was convinced there wasn't a single tree in America, because when I got there were all these beautiful, wonderful trees, and I thought, well, what's going on here? Why isn't it in the art, you know, fantasy art in particular? Because I'm inspired by nature, And so, and I do feel that fantasy isn't out there somewhere else. It's right here now. It's on your doorstep. You know? So it's about my response to the world. And so my drawing is based on what I see, and what I see, like the shapes of trees. There's an organicness to it. So when I sketch, I don't have in my mind exactly what it looks like. I've got in my mind something that feels right. So the shapes and the forms of the lines I'm drawing, at some point have to, and if I've done it right, happily coalesce into a character. Now that is something then I have to nurture. So from the sketchiness, the nurturing is to bring that to life, is to bring it into 3 dimensions. Now it's sort of harder, you know, when you've got to sculpt, and Wendy's job is to try and do that, but it's got to follow the rhythms of some, you know, of something else. And so there's already life imbued or embedded in it, I suppose. And the further you get away from that, the deader it becomes. And so sketching is really, to me, is really important for these characters. But in what I learned from working with the Muppets is about some of those old techniques that I'll bring into life, about the mechanics of it. Well, you know what I mean. The mechanic is like a bit of stick, you know, a bit of something will do it. Because all the stuff I did was about how it, you know, brought to life. So yeah, sketching important.
I think you spoke about that really wonderfully in the interview as well. Heather asks, for Wendy now, and this may be another question you can't answer, but would Wendy ever consider developing any of her books into a puppet film, like The Winter Child, Heather suggests?
Oh, well, that's for Terri as well. Terri wrote them. I would love to, of course. It's just a question of collaborating with the right people to make it happen.
So making this child was so much fun, because we photographed it in our garden shed. We had a wonderful photographer who photographed all the spitting image characters, and then he documented our film work. But he would come down, and I would build the sets in the shed, and we would photograph it there. So
it felt like little movie sets the whole time we were doing
it,
which was really fun.
Yeah. And also it's still something that sort of has a resonance to it, and we've been talking about it now, but is that when we're driving to the supermarket and we go past there's like a building somewhere that looks like, thinking, oh, that could be a workshop, or wouldn't it be fun actually if we could make a little film? Because there's no reason nowadays why we can't be creative and make, you know, smaller scale stuff, but with just as much impact. So
probably because we're too old and grumpy now.
Yeah, we're too. Well, I'm definitely grumpy.
I can imagine you with your iPhones just creating new versions of Labyrinth and completely new things. Yeah, that's wonderful. Okay, so I have an interesting question from Halo. Your creative works have been hugely influential on many people's spirituality, but I'm curious as to when you each first felt that connection yourselves.
A spiritual connection. I think I, again, grew up with it. I think because my mother believed. She believed in the other world. She believed in fairies. She believed in all of that. And she taught me from an extremely young age that there was something more, that there was something beyond, something we couldn't see, but something that we could feel, and something that we could respond to and work with. So I think I've always felt that way. And I feel that it's very important. We both try to imbue what we do with healing, and with there's so much that isn't good in the world. We don't want to bring in things that are bad, you know, unless they're bad for a reason, like the Skeksis, then, you know, yeah. But otherwise, No, the spiritual part is very important.
Oh, I think I've already sort of said about my response to the landscape was that I was not that interested in what it looks like on the outside, but how it felt on the inside. And that seems to be is the secret of everything, is to be engaged with the inner nature and try to realize it. Because
and pay attention.
Yeah, and also I think Wendy's right, it is interesting that we became more and more involved with the idea of healing, and so we don't always consciously put it in the work, but we always expect it to be part of how we work, is to have some healing qualities to it. And it's fascinating to be part of a fantasy world, and because some of my images can get very, very strange, but they're there to take you somewhere and to give you the ability to change and grow. So some of the images can be challenging, but I see that in parallel to a lot of people do fantasy art, and to me it's horrific. I mean, just awful. And it's very, very, it's very easy to do images that are
frighteningly horrific, that kind of horrific.
Yeah. I don't mean in terms of technique. I mean in terms of well, they are, because it's actually easy to do something ugly. And I've often said that to people. Say, do something beautiful. It's the hardest thing. But I'm not defining what beautiful looks like. I'm saying, you know, some of the things that are a bit challenging as an image are also beautiful. And so that our desire to have an underpinning of spirit to it, but it's not a spirit. It's we try to invoke it, I think, is the best way of saying it. We're not saying this is it, you will feel this. It's about how you become part of a relationship with image. And so with flat art, it is there is time to be part of to discover what is going on underneath and where it's taking you to. But I think with puppetry, it actually brings it straight to you. It actually opens up the doors because there is physical movement that that is engaging. If it's the right word. Yeah.
I've loved your speaking about open doors. I've loved your speaking about realism, about working as realism. I've really enjoyed that account of healing as being absolutely central to your art, because I think of that as something that fantasy does a lot, and I think it may be something that maybe needs more exploring. We have another question, which is a family question. Everybody got terribly excited on the chat when you were talking about Toby and Grace. Can you talk a little about what it's been like seeing Toby also work in puppetry, and what it's like all working together?
It's amazing. Because we did all work together on the Age of Resistance. It was wonderful. He's an incredible sculptor and puppet builder, for one thing. And he is also very, very good at working with people. And he became the liaison between Brian and the rest of the workshop. When Brian would do these tiny sketches and people would go, I don't understand what this is. And Toby would go, what it means is this. And then he could explain it and also work in 3 dimensions to help them get it right. And they did get it right for you with Toby's help. But he's wonderful at directing. He's just great, and he's really funny. And anybody, I think, who has the chance to work with him should, because he's just great.
Some of the best moments, and one in particular, working with Toby on the Netflix series, is that we're always up to the last minute trying to finish things, and so that we would go in at 6:30 in the morning, because we'd start filming at 9 o'clock, 9:30. And so Toby and I on our knees in front of a costume, gluing some things on, aging it down, just to last minute things. And I remember, and I thought, it doesn't get any better than this, like literally working side by side with my son, you know, so happy that how creative he is on that stuff. But there was one moment when I was like trying to get one of these like fetish objects on the mystic, onto the Skeksis. I hit something and I started on my thumb and I started to bleed, and I sort of bled all over the costume. And it just seemed to me suddenly that was symbolic and right, because I think that it's the final magical act you need for all puppets is to bleed on it. Suddenly part of my life was part of its life. And it really was, it took it back to something really rather ancient about what these objects are that, you know, that you try to imbue with life. So not that I recommend everybody bleeding on the puppet, but
I don't know.
We'll have to remember that. Bleed on things that you've made.
Very carefully.
So one more question. I think we're running out of time, but Jen asks, are there any particular characters that have stayed with you over the years or that are particularly close to your hearts?
Oh, I don't know. I think they come to me, they come into focus and then leave again. Sometimes the Gelflings are very close, and for some reason they will come into focus again for me, especially Kira. But sometimes other things will, some of the strange little creatures will. I never know what's going to come forward and say, remember me? Look at me. But they do.
Well, in Dark Crystal, there are bugs that go across the table when they're eating. And we had meetings about this. It went on for weeks because we actually offloaded making these bugs to the special effects, really. So we helped with like the design and everything. And we spent weeks where they like did a track that went across the table and it was going to run around here and do all that. And it didn't work. And I said, I remembered as a kid these wind-up toys, and we sort of tracked them down. I think we imported some from China or something, glued a couple of feathers on, wound them up, and let them go. And it's in the film. It's like, I think the first take, it just goes across the table, he grabs it and puts it in his mouth. So it's the simplest things often are the easiest. Like, don't overthink things. Allow the characters come to life. So that's fine. And there is one bug that goes across the corridor. I had never any time to, unfortunately, to be on the set. I was too busy in the workshops getting the next puppets ready. So, but I did the day I went, I wound up a bug, and I thought it was the most expressive wound up bug I've ever seen in movies.
So your memory is of a wind-up bug. I absolutely love that. And this is a fantastic place, I think, to end the question and answer session. I'd just like to thank you so warmly for making a lot of people's dreams come true. Yeah, I'd like to, I think we're going to take a little lunch break now. But I'm sure everyone here is going to be applauding crazily on this side of the screen. Thank you so much for being part of this, and we will. Yep, we've still got the rest of the day to come, but yours
sure it'll be wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting us. Yeah. We really enjoyed it.
Really a good time.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, we'll take that lunch break, but please join us again at 1:30 for an interview with William Todd-Jones, whose puppeteering credits stretch from The Never-Ending Story and the BBC Chronicles of Narnia, in which he played Aslan, to the recent BBC production of His Dark Materials. Not to be missed.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. We're still on.